We've covered Germany's use of obsolete single-action revolvers during the Great War, but they would not be alone. Russia would also field a popular six-gun better known in the American West. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Russian 4.2 line revolver, better known in the US as the Smith & Wesson No.3 Russian 3rd model. Now this gun is single action only, and it needs to go into the light box. Weighing in at 2.5 pounds and reaching just over 12 inches in length, this is a very big revolver. It has a 6-round cylinder, chambering the 11mm Russian cartridge. Alright, so in order to get into this gun, we are going to need to dial things back and get a little contextual history, as we always do. And we've covered part of this before with our earlier series on the K-frame, which was then cloned by the Spanish. Go check out that episode if you care. But reasonably, I'm just going to reproduce most of that very briefly right here so you can catch up. This is Horace Smith, whose father worked for the Springfield Armory. He grew up in gunmaking and would apprentice in his youth, becoming a tool maker. Long story short, he'd end up working for the then famous Robbins and Lawrence. Now technically, Smith had worked at a number of places, including Allen, Brown, and Luther, who made machine tools and gun barrels. But this job and the one at Robbins and Lawrence are significant because both places would also employ one Daniel Wesson. Wesson was born to a farming family, but his older brother Edwin had established himself as a gunsmith in 1835. In 1842, he would sign an apprenticeship for his younger brother Daniel, paying $250 to their father in order to get 3.5 years of his brother's service. Now the younger Wesson learned a lot of lessons from his older brother, who had to leave town often to defend patent claims. This put Daniel in charge of the shop on the regular. As a matter of fact, he'd be the one to greet Samuel Colt and Captain Sam Walker when they dropped in to price the manufacture of a series of barrels. While there, Walker would purchase a custom percussion rifle, and later wrote to the elder Wesson that he would be purchasing 1,000 more. On the strength of that letter, the Wessons got to work. Now, the brothers Wesson did not have a lot of capital, so they had to borrow heavily and leverage ownership of the business in order to get this order under control. Unfortunately, Walker never actually came through with his end of the non-bargain. He had just written a letter saying, "I sure would like to buy 1,000 of these," and no contract or handshake, so why would he now have to pay for 1,000 of these? Whoops. So, that leaves them in dire financial straits, and in January of 1849, unexpectedly, Edwin Wesson would pass away. I'm not sure quite of what, but nobody was expecting it. And that meant that everybody that he owed money came running. And so, the younger Wesson, Daniel, would have to work for the estate for a while in order to settle things out and satisfy all these sort of creditors, and basically they just gutted the business. They sold what could be sold, they ran off patents that they had, yada yada, and then they shut her down. As a matter of fact, Daniel would have to sue his own brother's estate to try to get his tools back, and failed. That is how far down he had fallen. And so he'd have to return to the working world from scratch. Through a series of jobs, he too would end up at Allen, Brown, and Luther, and more importantly later Robbins and Lawrence. See, the key feature here is that R&L was working on the Jennings rifle, and several employees thought they could do better. One man, named Henry, would take his own ideas out for a walk, but we'll talk about that some other time. Wesson would team up with his new friend Smith and work up a pistol company. I won't go into detail, but this became Volcanic Arms, which was revolutionary but overreached and collapsed, resulting in a buyout by Oliver Winchester. So their first attempt wasn't a complete failure. There's a lot that comes out of the Volcanic evolution that really makes the Winchester brand that we know all the way up until today. But they didn't make that money. That was somebody else. Instead, Wesson stayed with the company, acted as foreman for a while, but Smith, he went home and ran a stable for a bit. Until, well, about a year or so later, 1856, when Daniel decided that he was going to go back and partner up with his friend one last time because he had another good idea. He had noticed that Colt's patent on the, basically, revolver. I mean, Colt had the revolver locked down in patent, that was expiring, which means that now without paying Colt, people could come up with all sorts of mechanical, very easily indexed revolvers, and this was going to be an explosive market because suddenly there's going to be competition where there was none. And so they wanted to capitalize on that. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because that would be a beautiful story for another day, but basically we see the Smith & Wesson #1 and #2 revolvers emerge out of this and establish the whole company. These simple rimfires were advanced in their day and sold briskly, making the partnership a success. More importantly, Smith & Wesson bought up a simple patent that Colt had already passed on from a former employee named Roland White. He had locked down the patent for boring through a cylinder, straight through a cylinder, in order to chamber a cartridge. Now, you cannot overstate how important this patent is. It's so obvious. But remember, we're coming from cap and ball. So in cap and ball, you wouldn't necessarily bore straight through. You had a nipple at the end with a smaller flash hole, yada yada. When we're going into metallic cartridge, rimfire, centerfire, yeah, we just want to take a cylinder and drill a hole through and stick our cartridge in. Locking that down is incredible. That makes you the de facto to the market. I mean, you own the market there. So anybody who wants to make a revolver in the cartridge era while that patent's in effect is paying Smith & Wesson for the right, in America at least. Beautiful. Now, this goes one step further though, because Wesson, who had seen his brother constantly coming and going fighting patents, decided that when he licensed from Roland White, well, he said, look, we'll pay you for this thing, but you have to protect the patent. When somebody else messes with it, you got to chase them down and you got to sue them. Roland White spent like the rest of his life chasing around his own patent. Well, not the rest of his life, but he was in court a lot, and it cost him a lot of money, and he didn't make very much off Smith & Wesson because of all the cost of defending the patent. And meanwhile, Wesson got to stay at home. Absolutely brilliant. Anyway, this protects Smith & Wesson for quite a while, but it's not forever. As a matter of fact, it would only last until 1869. And so right as that patent's coming to an end, they realize they need something revolutionary to bring to the market, also patentable, that they can sort of lock things down. And that idea would be the Smith & Wesson #3 top break revolver, also now known as the Ist Model American. It was introduced in a .44 caliber rimfire cartridge, but that would quickly switch to centerfire. Now, this design didn't just erupt from nowhere. It was the culmination of a few ideas. Instead of being a gun wholly conceived by both Smith and Wesson, this was actually the amalgamation of a couple patents that were held in the US. But realistically, top breaks had existed since at least 1860, but they weren't necessarily locked down by patent, and they really didn't have a good extraction system, which is the heart of this pistol today. So, Smith & Wesson would buy up two particularly important patents in order to do this particular gun. William C. Dodge had worked out a great locking hinged action, which allowed for rapid opening and loading of a revolver and still providing good strength to that lock. Charles A. King's patent provided an amazing automatic tooth and gear ejection system, which was activated by opening up the revolver. So with their patent expiring, they now had probably the most advanced revolver in the United States. And yeah, it wasn't the first at a number of these things, but it was the best. It was fantastic. And to put it into perspective, you have a single action, it is single action, let's hold that, but you have a top break, simultaneous extract, rapid loading, ready to rock and roll revolver, ready by 1870. Now, for perspective, Colt's Model 1873 would come out in, you will never guess what year. Now, as I said, the first chambering for, well, not quite this particular gun, was a .44 caliber rimfire cartridge. Now, this example was sent over to the U.S. Ordnance Board, and one John M. Schofield got a good look at it and said, this thing's beautiful. It's the most advanced revolver I've ever seen. It's fantastic. Have you not heard of centerfire cartridges? This is insanity. And so they would fix that one little problem. So the .44 Henry cartridge would be adapted into the .44 Smith & Wesson centerfire cartridge, and the gun was improved for it. This netted a contract for 1,000 revolvers by the U.S. government in December of 1870. They were delivered by March of 1871, but it did not create any extra orders that Smith & Wesson wanted. That Ist Model American was considered just too delicate for military work. And it's not an unfair assessment as much as people like to rant and rave. Plus, and one day we'll get into the Colts and stuff of that era, there's some little backdoor dealing and some concerns about rigidity and parts replacement. It's a thing. The US government, however, was not going to go with any more number 3s at this time. So Smith & Wesson would have to find buyers elsewhere. Now, thankfully, they had gone ahead and set samples everywhere they could think of to any possible buyers. And one of those would just so happen to be the Russian military attaché, one General Alexander Gorlov, who was in the US and doing some business with Colt. Gorlov had been appointed to the US in 1868 and was in the process of overseeing Colt's manufacture of the Berdan rifle and Russian contract Gatling guns. With an early sample Smith & Wesson revolver in hand, he had taken a trip home and created quite a stir. You see, Russia was still using some outdated single-shot pistol technology, but they weren't entirely flustered by this at first. Russia was still trying to weigh out the value of a military pistol. Rifles and carbines, that's the way to go, right? Well, like so many other armies, they really started to find the value in a repeating handgun when they dealt with cavalry. So in that regard, they're going, okay, yeah, we got guys on horseback. They have carbines that they use not necessarily on horseback all the time. They tend to dismount and use them, but when they are riding, every once in a while, they might want to pop a shot from the horse, and the pistol's the way to go there. And it'd be nice if they could reload and then use the pistol again, because right now it's all single shot percussion caps. So they're just getting a shot off. That is it. Now, they would play around with some revolvers, don't get me wrong. A big one that they really considered and even bought some of was the Galland. This ended up in naval use and other things. Not our topic today. But realistically, right before Gorlov shows up, they're really weighing out a number of odd guns until they finally settle on, of all things, Remington single-shot rolling block style pistols. And if that seems insane, it's because they have the ability to fire it and on horseback very clearly open and reload it without any mistakes. So the emphasis on the Remington rolling block pistol being adopted over a 6-shot gate loader is that yes, I only get 1 shot at a time, but I can reload it, versus 6 shots, and then there's not much hope of reloading a gate loader on horseback. So their mindset was already on, how do we get ammo into the gun? That part makes sense. So imagine you're looking at one of those Remington rolling block single shots like this one, and then you're shown something like this. This is a much better gun for that role, and you can still load it rapidly. Now, while the Russian military did see the potential in this gun, there were still some concerns, the same concerns that the US had. And so, they sent Gorlov over to Smith & Wesson to knock out some details about what would make a proper No. 3 style military pistol. He would head over in March of 1871, just 4 days after the final delivery of the US government contract. That means he found a company that was eager to make another large sale and ready to alter their design. With the help of his captain, Cassaveri Ordonez, the following changes would be incorporated into the design. A wider cylinder retainer, an interlocking feature added to the hammer that held the action closed when in the down position, a limiting tooth added to the extractor gear, a hardened bushing added to the frame around the firing pin, a front sight made from steel instead of soft German silver, and after about 3,000 units, they also made several other adjustments: a larger diameter trigger pivot pin, a bolster added to the frame to make it stronger at that same point, and an improved 2-piece joint pivot. Now these changes would be made across the whole of production, so the No. 3 was overall improved. One final change would be crucial, however. You see, the .44 Smith & Wesson was a heeled bullet, meaning that that bullet was lipped to make an equal diameter across the whole length of the cartridge. This allowed a straight wall bore-through cylinder. The Russians, however, supposedly wanted to internally lubricate the bullet to prevent buildup of black powder, so they wanted to get away from the heel. Now this doesn't always play out in examples that we've seen, but this is the story I know. Also, while we're at it, can we get a little more weight and some more oomph in the cartridge? This resulted in the .44 Smith & Wesson Russian cartridge, which would eclipse the original .44 American in popularity. This heavy hitter would remain an amazing commercial success for decades to come. And with that final change, actually not this handgun. This is a little bit further down the road, but rather the first model Russian would be ready to go. Easily spotted by its plain trigger guard and 8-inch barrel, a contract was signed in January of 1873 for 100 a day, with a price of $15.35 a pop. 20,014 were sent to Russia in total, although a few thousand more saw commercial sales. The first model was definitely a good gun, but it wasn't perfect. Captain Ordnance would especially have some concerns and recommend changes. Those included shortening the barrel to 7 inches, a knuckle on that handle for a better grip, and a hooked trigger guard, which actually eased handling the gun for single-action shooting. This resulted in the second model, which during its production saw an improved joint pivot key that eliminated the lock screw. 70,000 of these would be sold on contract, with even more commercial sales and several other foreign militaries buying. Notably, 5,000 went to the Japanese Navy, and at least 1,000 more to the Ottomans, who were already using the old 44 Henry rimfire cartridge, so the No. 3 got back to its roots for that contract. Still, the Russians thought the gun could be improved, and so more changes were made. This included a 6.5-inch barrel, a forged front sight instead of being soldered on, simplified extraction system, a shorter extractor housing, and a quick removable cylinder using a thumbable top screw. That last one was pretty slick. One big screw with little striations on it so that you could turn it with your hands, and you could quickly release the cylinder and ejector for cleaning and inspection. Nice. These improvements would net the third and final Russian model. It was produced consecutively with the second model until 1878. 41,138 would be sold to the Russians. By now, manufacturing savings meant the price was down to a flat $15. I should also point out that this third model was offered with an optional removable stock. Sweet. Now again, another 1,000 of these went over to the Japanese Navy, and somewhere between 5 and 15,000, my numbers in my books really vary pretty widely on this one, went over to the Ottomans. And I'm going to talk more on that in just a moment. Instead, let's go ahead and take a look at what we have finally arrived to our model today, the third model Russian, the last of the Russian series, and the most numerous, although we'll find out why in a moment. So, let's take a closer look. Woo! There we go. That is a dark and beautiful finish. Now, this gun is single action only and a top break open. So I'm going to pop her open. As I pop her open, watch. Oh, she's extracting, and then at the end, boom, we're ready to load rapidly. Much more rapidly than almost any contemporary design. Now, you can see that she's unloaded, so I can go ahead and show you that there is no double action. I have to manually cock and then drop, and then manually cock, and then drop. Now, if I let her fall all the way through as if she had been fired, all the way to the ground, we're gonna see that there's a notch in the hammer that's holding on to that lock so that the action cannot be open. This keeps it surely locked or prevents discharge when out of battery. So this is a beautiful safety feature. If you want into the gun, you're gonna have to go to your trusty half cock, sort of, and then pop her open. Being a single action, this is not a safety half cock in the sense that you would with a double single where you could put it in and then it locks up the trigger, because the trigger ain't gonna do anything until we get her all the way back anyway. But that's to let us in to here. Now, being the third model, we have our finger rest here. That in particular to me is meant very specifically to help in handling the hammer. If you do not have that finger rest and you're trying to, and I'm sorry I got meaty hands, and let's say you got your, okay, so we've got finger on the trigger because that's what they used to do. I know it's not proper nowadays, but that's what they used to do. So your finger would have been on the trigger, your hand would have been back here, you'd had to reach up for this guy, scoot maybe, but then see how we've got this beautiful heel. And that thing, by the way, that knuckle is great for handling. You know exactly where to put your hand. You're not sliding up and down. I'm sure Mae's gonna have a strong opinion here. So we'd have to climb the knuckle and hold down here to get this hammer, or we could just sort of, I mean, I got big hands, guys, and I'm just barely reaching that hammer. I can do it, it's just not comfortable and that blade's really slicing into me. But if my hands sort of spread out like this, and I'm up higher on the gun, I'm gripped further forward, and by the way, this is getting kind of close to a more modern understanding of ergonomics, well, I can just reach up here and pop her back. It's beautifully comfortable. The other thing that it does is it allows me to put leverage between this middle finger and up here. So I'm punching through these two. So I'm pulling there. If I don't have that lever point, if it's all the way back here, I'm basically trying to use this inside portion of my hand up on this inside portion of the frame and just torquing back like any other single action of the day. I honestly believe that as far as single action cocking goes, this is an improvement. Nah, I have big hands. We'll get a later opinion in a moment. Now, all that said, there's one final feature that we want to talk about, which is the ability to pop out that cylinder. So, clear, and then I don't know if you guys can really see it, but there's a lip up under here, and even my pointy's not going to get in there. We are going to unthread this big screw right up top. Now, I set it a little bit tight, so I'm probably going to have to bum a screwdriver, which I forgot to have in frame. So let me pan away for 1 second while I sneak one over to myself. Ooh, look at that magic. All right, let's get back into it. So, ideally, if you wanted to wrestle with it, and I'm sorry guys, I'm like way out of frame here. If you guys wanted to wrestle with it, you could just really thumb down on that, but I'm not about to crank on it. Instead, I'll just gently get in there with a screwdriver and pop her loose. With that out, I just have to back her out, not all the way, but enough to release a flat plate inside, at which point this guy will be able to come off the end of the action. Except if I start to yank on it, and I'm sorry, this is an older gun and there's some smudge in there. See how I can get the cylinder to come free, but I'm still elastically stuck? That's because there's a second phase to this. There is a button down here that I must depress in order to release. So I've got to hold that guy very tightly. I'm white knuckling this, and then boom, she pops out. And that's all it is. I got to hold the button again and shove her back in. We're ready to rock and roll. But that, for its time, is a very simple way to get into a revolver for cleaning and, you know, inspection. Honestly, a beautiful system and obviously advanced. All right, so you've had a tour of a simple and yet complicated single action. I mean, this gun's getting right up into an almost modern perspective on firearms. Ain't too bad. By the way, pro tip, that little plate that sort of slid out to let the cylinder free, if you just close her up, it'll shove itself back in. You can turn the screw back down and it should be lined up just right. So let's see if I did that correctly. Hey, that's not too bad for 1870s technology. Now, let's get a closer look at how this whole thing really works with an animation from Bruno. Being a top break, we'll need to lever up this lock, which frees the action to tip open for loading. Now check out that hammer. Being a single action, we have to cock it back manually in order to fire. The trigger in this design is as simple as can be. It only has two functions, to be a sear, and two, to work the tip of the cylinder stop. As a matter of fact, the hand is even mounted to the hammer. This is the component that revolves the cylinder. Heading back to that cylinder stop, it is very simple. A spring keeps it constantly pressed upwards, but an extension on the trigger tips it out of lock so that the cylinder can begin rotating. It just drags along the outside of the cylinder until it pops into the cylinder stop notch. Now take a look at this toothed drum. When we open the action, it does not rotate. That causes the extractor to protrude. When fully opened, the barrel extension tips that lever at the bottom, letting the drum rotate and dropping the extractor for loading. Alright, let's get this over to Mae.
I dreamed of a scene in an old soldier's home. The year was 1953. With medals galore that he'd won in this war, he sat smoking peacefully. Tell me of the war of 1917, said his grandson who stood by his side. How did they fix up that terrible mix-up and proud the old man replied, the Russians were Russian, the Prussians were crushing the Russians. The Balkans were balking and Turkey was squawking, Rasputin and Italy hooting, the Bolsheviks, the British passing the sea. But the good Lord, I'm thanking the Yanks started yanking and started yanking, and Yank Kaiser feel up a tree. My dream quickly changed to a schoolroom that day. The lesson was geography. A child raised her hand, said, I don't understand.
You know, I know that this is a Russian service pistol, but I'm going to tell you it's un-American not to love this thing. Now, this would be a big success for Smith & Wesson in terms of the Russian contract because a little over 130,000 would be delivered from Smith & Wesson specifically. That is amazing. Now, during production of the third pattern, we'll see our good Captain Ordnance move on, and so his stamp would be retired for inspection, and we'll instead see Captain Kuschikowitz step in with his own marking. Now, before production even finished, Russia got a chance to test their new handguns in the Russo-Turkish War. In this conflict, Russia aided the Balkan states in their bid for independence from the weakened Ottoman Empire. A notable result of this victory was a strengthened Balkan nationalism, which we know is a huge component behind the start of World War I. Now, in that conflict, Russia actually fielded these pretty widely, because they weren't just for cavalrymen. They also were intended for artillery and officers and even some infantry role. These things were much wider issued than most handguns in that period, and it seems that they were a great success. Now, in fairness though, even though they were single action only, they had a beautiful cartridge, beautiful handling, highly accurate, and you could always club somebody to death if you really needed to. And they were up against, really at best from the Ottoman side, if they were even present on the front line, maybe something like the Gasser 1870. That is, of course, unless they were lucky enough to have one of these, because as I said, the Ottomans had ordered somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 of these bad boys themselves. So that put Smith & Wesson in the position, the enviable position, of basically supplying both sides of a very large conflict. That is some good money-making opportunity. Now, after the Smith & Wesson contract, the Russians still wanted more of these guns. And they were taking it a bit more personally now, because apparently they liked them. I mean, when you double down on a design after a war, great. And at that time, don't forget, a number of double actions are appearing. And they're big bore double actions, but usually a little milder than this, or at least some of them might be capable of pushing the same load, don't get me wrong. But instead, Russia's staying with single action. And a big part of that is the same as the magazine cutoff idea at the time. You don't want to waste shots. If we give somebody double action, they're going to panic and just unload their gun at the first guy they see, and that's going to be the only guy they kill. So we want to make sure that they aim and fire, and aim, and fire. And the idea is that the single action, that time, that little click is just enough time to focus, and then make your shot. Because you want it to count if it's going to take you a whole other hand motion to get it back. We know that that's not necessarily the correct doctrine, especially at close combat, but that was the thought at the time. And so, the Russians would, again, like I said, double down on this particular gun. And some of you may have noticed earlier, there's something odd about this particular revolver I'm holding. If you got a good, quick look at this top rib, which I doubt you did because I don't think our resolution's that good, you may have noticed something very odd. What's up with these markings? They say Berlin. Well, after wrapping that last number 3 contract with Smith & Wesson, Russia engaged Ludwig Lowe to produce another 100,000 in 2 contract lots. This was likely a cost savings move, but they would also buy machinery from Ludwig Lowe to equip their own Tula arsenal, who would then produce the same gun starting in 1886. This carried on until 1897, and in total, 31,435 more revolvers were added to their inventory. Now, the number 3 didn't just serve with Russia. As I noted, the Ottoman Empire and Japan dug in. Also, clones were produced in Spain and Belgium, which saw military use in places like Mexico and Cuba. Additionally, it's said that Tsar Nicholas II presented 30,000 surplus models to Prince Nicola of Montenegro in 1904. And we're fairly certain Bulgaria received quite a few as well as war aid, using them in the Great War. Those surpluses were made possible because this revolver was abandoned in 1895 in favor of a more modern one, a double and single action, although some just single action. This is the Nagant. Now, I know a lot of you have been pushing me very hard to go ahead and make this episode, and trust me, it's on the way as soon as possible, but there's a little thing in the way, which is that we've got to come up with dies, because Russia wasn't the only user. This is a Belgian pistol after all. Unless somebody's got 9.4 laying around, it's going to take us a little work to get all the way there. So I'm going to put these guys aside. And go back to this gun. That's another episode, another day. Because it didn't just vanish with the appearance of the Nagant. Instead, the number 3 was still on hand and still in fair use when war were declared. That's right, Russia mobilized so many men for the war that they ran out of even the guns they had a lot of. And we've covered this a lot in the series. They went back to single-shot black powder rifles. They went back to single-action black powder pistols, whatever they could dig up. Now, of course, the expectation is that this would be as far to the rear as possible, and hopefully the Nagant would be up at the front line. That's not always the case. Now, usually I like to get you a few personal stories, but unfortunately I can't find any direct statements about the use of this single action on the front lines, or really mentioned at all in a lot of Russian literature, although I think we can forgive that given the tumultuous nature of that conflict. I don't think a lot of people were putting down their opinions of pistols in the middle of everything that happened to Russia. But regardless, this gun served, and there's evidence that it also served with Bulgaria and Montenegro, who both would have been very short on supplies as well, and would take anything that they had on hand. There was certainly fresh ammo for them in all those countries, so it was a ready go-to weapon. And honestly, I'm going to say probably not the worst thing to be wielding in terms of a single action. It's certainly, to me, a step above the Reich's revolver, which was also dusted off by the Germans. Now, I know that's a little anticlimactic because I don't have personal stories or a lot of dialogue on just what happened with this gun in the war. I can't even turn up exactly who it was issued to, although I suspect it would probably be more likely to go with artillerymen if it made it to the front at all. So instead, I'm going to have to buy you guys off with something else. This revolver over here, because this is the gun that replaced the No. 3 Russian. You see, once the Russians were done with this gun, Smith & Wesson had to come up with something else to sell. And that became this, the new model. Now, the new model No. 3 normally doesn't have a little diddly down here, so I have to tell you a separate story. But first, this is how it's supposed to look. It was introduced in 1878 and combined improvements from the American small bore series and Russian contrast. Most notably, it had an improved cylinder retention system. You see, this little doodle right here means that this particular gun was part of a 5,000 unit contract to the Ottomans. They had already bought in on some of the earlier models like I covered, and they wanted to keep the same pattern but get all the new improvements. And they still wanted it in 44 Henry rimfire. Unbelievable, but it certainly made supply simpler. Now, there's a lot of Ottoman guns that we haven't covered. You're never really going to see an Ottoman-specific pistol episode from us because we can't really hone down on a widely adopted general issue Ottoman pistol. Instead, we see signs of modified Gossers, and we'll talk about that when we get there. We see signs of things like the FN 1903 that we covered, where they ordered some for government use, and it's still argue whether it's police or military or what. And then we have contracts for the C96. We've already covered the C96. Basically, the Ottomans bought in a lot of weird stuff. But in this case, we have a distinctly Ottoman pistol in my hand because it's a unique modification of the new model. Now, we're not going to get to shoot it because of the way it's set up for a rimfire cartridge, and honestly, we got all the performance we ever need out of the Russian to get a good opinion on these guns. Instead, let's just take a quick look at what makes this one different, since we finally have sort of an Ottoman luxury. All right, so zooming in, we're going to see some distinct differences between this and the old Russian, most notably up here at our pinch. This guy's really designed to be grabbed from both sides and lifted. This guy has the same ability, but there's more of a sort of rear to front push, and it's much easier to do sort of one-thumbed right there, beautifully smooth. Now, this gun is also going to be a little important for our next episode, hint, hint about what's coming up. So let's look at another important design detail, which is that when we pop this guy open and we want to release our cylinder, instead of a screw or any fanciness, we just have to keep lifting on our unlocking surface. I'm sorry guys, let me get where you can see. I just keep lifting on that, pull this guy back, and just give him some rotation. That's a little hard to do on camera, but there she goes. That's it. Super simple. Lift it, put it back in there, rotate it down. We are good to go. You do not get it any easier than that. Otherwise, this is still a single action only, and it really did okay, but it doesn't have the legacy of that Russian model. All right, so we're all settled there. We have a little peek at an Ottoman treasure. You know what? I'm sorry. I almost left you guys out for one thing. Let's zoom in one more time. All right, sorry guys. Half cock, pop open, and then let's check one other thing really quickly. Look right, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get out the patented plastic. Look right in here, and you'll see that when our hammer falls, and I can do that out of battery, our hammer falls, look very carefully, right into that split. That is the rimfire modification. They plated it, cut, and set it so that it would hit the rim up on the edge, the rim of the cartridge, in order to fire that 44 rimfire cartridge. All right, sorry. Just want to make sure you guys didn't miss out on every little wonderful detail. By the way, special thanks to our good friends who always loan us these things. In this case, both of these, plus another example that we managed to get our hands on, they all came from Michael Carrick. So thank you again for that loan. You've been an incredible help to the show, and these are very rare birds. We're very happy that he puts them in the mail for us. Now, everybody say thanks to Michael. Okay, good. Now, let's get back to Russia, though, because we have fired this one, and let's get Mae's opinion on actually handling this beast. All right, once more, we've made room for Mae, and we've made just enough room to fit this monster of a revolver. So we're going to need to get her opinion, there you go, on the Smith & Wesson No. 3 Russian, and as usual, we're going to start with the ergonomics, and let me tell you, compared to any other handgun we've had in terms of revolvers, this probably has the most unique ergonomics. I'm very curious to see how you feel handling this gun.
Guys, if y'all haven't seen the Reichs revolver episode, please go back and watch that, because that was the biggest honkin' revolver I thought I would handle to date, and it was awful. This is actually a perfect example of what could have been done right to make that revolver amazing. So this revolver is big, it's heavy. If I were holding the grip all the way in the back, like with the Reichs revolver, it would be awkward to handle. It would be an incredibly long reach in order to pull this hammer back. I wouldn't enjoy it like I did with the Reichs revolver. However, they've added on a handy dandy little trigger spur back here, which is perfect because all of my control is then put right back here into the webbing of my thumb and onto the middle finger. So like with a modern handgun, all of my control is right here with those two fingers. It is perfect. And the angle back here with the knuckle, it's beautiful. It fits perfectly into the webbing of my hand. I feel like I've got fantastic control of this gun ergonomically. That was a wonderful surprise. I was not expecting that. The grip angle is perfect, fits right into the palm of your hand, no problem there. Now, this is a top brake that does require two hands. Like I could maybe push my thumb forward enough that I could access or move it, open up on my own. However, I really feel two hands is kind of necessary. It just gives you cleaner, easier access and just more control over it, so you're not really fiddling around with it. But yeah, ergonomically, this was surprisingly smooth and surprisingly pleasant. I really can't say how much this surprised me, I guess.
Yeah, I'm going to say that this episode invites an understanding of two prior episodes. One is the Reichs revolver, and two is actually the Webleys. Because when we saw... May I borrow that for a second?
Yeah.
When we saw the Reichs revolver, we saw a large, heavy, and long-barreled handgun. So that meant when Mae tried to wield that thing, it wanted to droop. And so she'd have to consciously keep it up. She'd have to keep it hawked up so that it would level out, right? Now, that gun did not have a knuckle at the rear for the webbing of the hand.
So that literally, I had to fight it on both angles. It was terrible.
Right. And then also mild recoil, it didn't come out as clearly in that, and that's why I mentioned the Webley episode, because in that 455 Webley episode, we saw with the Mark V that had no knuckle at the back of that gun. It was that nice round back for that sort of target-style shooting. We found that when you got out and extended it and fought like World War I style, it wanted to rock in your hand because there's nothing to keep it from just sliding down your palm. And then you'd have to toss it back to yourself. And it would slide down your palm. You have to toss it back to yourself.
You could white knuckle it and it would still slip in your hand. There was no hope.
Yeah, like fighting a squirrel that doesn't want to cuddle. Now, this gun has the knuckle. That's step one. That's a beautiful thing. And by the way, this knuckle is known on a number of pistols. We saw them add it to the Mark VI Webley so that you did have better control and you felt much better about that gun.
Which that on its own could have made it tolerable.
Right. The magic is this odd spur, which by the way, just me seeing it and the first time even picking up this gun, I thought, this is awkward. I'm not used to it.
Really? I felt natural with it.
I found it awkward up until I started pulling the trigger. And then I agree with Mae. You have the ability to steer the gun more positively. And when you're dealing with a single action, a lot of you know this, you have to reach up for this hammer, especially if you're one-handing it. It's natural human instinct to want to find purchase. And if you're watching me, you can even see my index finger starting to grip. Well, if I had shorter hands, I wouldn't have anything to purchase here except for the trigger, and you're very likely to have negligent discharges because of fingering the trigger, especially 100 years ago. This takes up all of that instinct and lets you hold onto the gun, grip the gun, without messing with the trigger. I have perfect purchase, and yet I don't have to put any tension into my index finger. It's actually really nice, and I'm kind of surprised it hasn't been tried again ever. Now, I know it's because we also moved to two-handed shooting. At this point, it's a little redundant because we went with bell grips and other things that we see. And then in the modern era, we see really contoured grips that actually get close to pushing out to this sort of width away from the back edge of the grip again. So I think it's actually a smart idea. It just seems so crazy because it's sticking off like that, and it seems so decorative, but I think there's some utility there. Now, sorry, I'm stealing some show there. Why don't you walk us through loading and then shooting this gun? Because I imagine some things familiar, some things not.
So I went into it a little bit in the ergonomics before. It's top brake. You definitely want to make sure you're using two hands just because you can get a positive pull on it. I wish it were kind of a little more like a Webley though, where it's got a little push button there. That way it's easier to manipulate, but this one's still not bad. It's just not as smooth as I would like it. Make sure you snap it all the way forward. And that angle is a little bit awkward in that I can't just hold the gun like so to load it. You definitely have to pull it back some. I mean, that's a minor detail, but just something I happened to notice while on range. Definitely going to make sure I report everything to you guys. Want to make sure you snap her forward, line her up, and those sights are not the best. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're legible, but it's got a few problems with it. So the front sight, it's definitely a little too, I guess it's just a little too big, and it's really kind of hard to see when you're first shooting it on range exactly where the top of it is because it kind of bleeds together a little bit. So you definitely want to make sure you take a little time to practice with that one because it does take some getting used to. And then the rear sights, they're a little too close together and not quite tall enough, I feel. So maybe they could have just pushed them out just a little bit from each other and made them a little bit taller, and then they would have been perfect. So sight's definitely not the best on this guy, but I do have a decent sight radius, so that does help. So hooray for that. Work a little bit on everything else, please, and thank you. The hammer, this is interesting. So this hammer is actually a really nice positive hammer in that I do not feel like I'm going to have an accidental slip on it. Like it's really high arced up at the top. It's sharp. Like I really feel like I've got a nice, good positive purchase on that. That combined with this nice trigger spur down here, it gives me fantastic leverage. The two of them combined, I don't really see how anyone could have a negligent discharge with this one just because those two combined are a perfect combination for safety. So good on them. The one thing I will say is I again appreciate this how high up the hammer arcs and the sharpness of it, but the problem is that is going to kind of bite into your thumb a little bit. So excessive use, maybe just be prepared for getting a little callus on your thumb. Just food for thought. And then the trigger, really, really smooth, single stage trigger. Like there was practically nothing there. Like it just felt like glass. That was amazing. That was a phenomenal thing to find out. I mean, that was beautiful, so I loved it. And then the recoil, don't get me wrong, it's got a big cartridge in there, but there's a lot of weight to this gun, and it handles it well, and I've got good stability on it with this grip. So honestly, the recoil on it was fine. Like you could tell there was a lot with it, and it's got a big sound to it, but you just are able to handle it so well. So kudos for them on the design on this. This was a single action done well. You know, I wish it were in double, but otherwise, this was a really fun shooter.
I know it's not very interesting, but I'm going to have to agree on all points, especially when it comes to that rear sight. This is of the era when they would give you one front sight, which in this case is a half moon, so just a round over top shape. We're going to see a lot of guns, and we talk about the Nagant, we'll see an actual changeover where you get a sort of a shark fin going on, where you got a nice solid flat vertical plane.
There's no question with the tops of those guys. This one, you can't see it easily. It just doesn't.
Right. Those rounded sights, they can be on certain guns, and I agree with you on this one. It's actually a little bit counterintuitive to find the top of that front sight. The other problem I have is because the rear sight is essentially gapped buck teeth at the rear, not a blade with a notch in it, but 2 little pegs, and then you line a third peg up into it. Now you're scanning for 3 pegs. Your mind is trying to take 3 points and align, or 3 points and align them like this, versus normally you just have this notch in a big plane, and then you just have to center the one thing and the other. And it's odd, but my mind tends to pick up on 3 distinct things, even though I know they're 2 components. It's not as fast, it's not as natural, and it's very hard to catch the heights because you're trying to read the height of something out at the front, very far at the front of this long sight radius barrel, and then you're trying to read the height of something that's now blurry in your vision because you're focused on the front sight, and it's very narrow. So now you're trying to pick the heights. If you have a whole blade at the rear, it's easier to kind of spot whether the height is actually aligned or not. I know it's a lot to explain, but I think you guys are following me. So it suffers from old style sights. It suffers from being a single action only. Are either of those enough to really stop you from wanting to use something like this in the Great War?
This is, without a doubt, like literally no doubt in my mind, my favorite revolver I have ever shot to date. And that's saying something. I've shot a lot of revolvers. And this thing was beautiful. That trigger spur, that hump, the recoil, the hammer. My God, there was so many positives that I didn't think I would find in a revolver. And yet, I would never take it into war. I would never take it into the Great War.
Dun, dun, dun! Actually, I kind of knew this might be coming. And I think I might know why. But you go right ahead and tell us. Okay,
so let's forget the sights. Yeah, they weren't fantastic, but hey, I've dealt with worse sights. Really have. The sharpness of the hammer, whatever, can still totally deal with that. It's a heavy revolver. Like I said, big deal. I'm handling it fine with everything else. All of that aside, the only thing that's holding it back is the fact that it is single action. The only thing that I have shot to date that is worse than this is the Reich's revolver. And this shows that it could have been done awesome, yet I'm still not going to take it into war. I'm still not going to take it into war, this being my personal favorite revolver ever. Like, I'm going to actually try to buy a reproduction someday when I can afford it because, dang, it is so beautifully amazing. But this is an era in which having single action only, the time that is lost in that, I may be able to shoot one dude at 100 yards, but if I've got multiple attackers, if I've got multiple targets, the amount of time that's lost on that, I may take down one. If I'm lucky, I may take down 2. That's it. I'm going down with it. And I just can't bet my life on that. So as much as I hate to say it, it will never be something I would ever take into the war. But heck yes, would it be something I would, take into my own personal collection in a heartbeat.
I always hate the episodes where I just end up agreeing with Mae. It's much more fun to fight.
What?
But I agree. Single action is just not really. It's too much of a vulnerability for World War I. By the time you're pulling a pistol in World War I, you really want to be able to fire fast. You want to dump that thing out and then hopefully reload it as fast as possible too. This is not the way to go in that field. And I know a lot of you are saying, you slick it up, you practice with it, and look at some of these cowboy... Like, I'm going to get links to fast draw, fast shoot videos all day long. And
yeah, that's fine, but the problem is that they've got years of experience, and they've got tons of ammo to burn. These guys going to the war, they don't have either of that.
Yeah, you're kind of lucky if you have 100 handgun cartridges going into conflict like this. Imagine if you had every office, like, for every one of these guns you issue 100, 200 rounds of ammo or something. I'm not sure. We'd have to get into some deep research by Army. But you definitely don't issue 5,000 rounds per handgun. And yet, that's what we're talking about to sort of train up to the level that these guys are at. They really got to get good at what they're doing. And if you're an officer or an artilleryman, your days are spent doing things other than just training with your handgun. It's not your primary weapon in the war. And so the handgun must be as automatic to the user, not necessarily an automatic handgun. It must be as natural and sort of unthinkingly clear in use. And no matter how much you get good at this thing, it's still multiple operations. It's fire, hammer, so your hammer, trigger. Versus,
and then even if you get fast at fanning it, you're interrupting your line of sight every time. I don't care how fast you get with it. That interruption, that's going to cost a life. It really will.
Yeah, and again, yes, you could be amazing at it. The average person is not going to be. And I certainly am not imagining that I'm going into the war as somebody who's just a trained pistol marksman and nothing else. That would be a very odd place to be in the conflict. Although it is wonderful to appreciate what people can do with a system like this. And by the way, it's a beautiful system, especially for its time. In its era, it is hard to beat. The Russians might have had the best single-action handgun ever, because it is a fantastic single-action handgun. It's just single-action. All right, so unless you have anything else for us, I think we can wrap this one out.
Nah, pretty good. I'm sorry to say that it's not going to war with me, but like I said, I want to have one personally myself one of these days. It is so dang cool.
Yeah, cool doesn't always mean sensible. Anyway, let's roll us out, check after the credits for any updates, and at this point, we're actually filming on New Year's Eve, so Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year, guys.
First and foremost, welcome to 2018. We here at C&Rsenal want to wish you and yours the best for this new year. Second, thank you all for writing out this unusual Patreon blip. I'm happy to say the service is back to normal, and we're very happy to have your continued support. Finally, there's been some discussion of a certain magnificent World War II project. We are absolutely in favor of taking part and have been offered a very nice way of collaborating with some friends you know. However, this will have two consequences unique to our series. One, we may have to shorten our World War I programming or intersperse it with World War II. This is tricky as I have promised to get as far into World War I as we possibly can, and I realistically cannot produce more shows or more often the same show than we have currently. It's just too heavy of a workload. Second, the 1940s are very much still under copyright protection, and it has often been an uphill battle even within our clearly public domain material that we use now. So our media-heavy format could get very expensive and very risky in terms of copyright strikes and bans if we do not do it right. This is where we'll need our partners to give us help before we can really commit. So while we are as excited as everyone else, please keep a little patience as we sort out the particulars so that we can give you a promise that we can deliver on. All right, thanks and bye.